Let us calculate some relative change. Now, before we jump into relative change, we need to kind of understand the progression of calculating change. Now, what we are doing with all three of these, absolute, relative, and percent change, is really talking about the change in values. And the key word change really means difference. Oh, and I cannot spell. Difference. So when we are talking about change, we are talking about the difference between values. So we like to say that absolute change is the absolute value of the final value minus the initial value. So you might, the final is like the new, right? So sometimes I talk about this as new minus old, but because it's absolute, we are talking about the absolute value of that. What is the difference between these two pieces? Now, next we go to relative change. So you're going to notice that absolute change is a number, right? Like 7, whatever. It's just a number. Relative change, we find that by taking the absolute change, which is what we found on the top, and dividing by the initial value. Okay, so now we are going to potentially have a number, like a whole number. It could be a fraction, could be a decimal, depending on how you want to write it. Okay, so our relative change. Then we go to percent change, and to find the percent change, we take the relative change and we multiply by 100, because multiplying by 100 is what changes something to a percent. So that's kind of the progression. There are just 3 different ways to talk about the change in values. So let's go ahead and do a couple examples. The price of Apple stock on March 17th, 2021 closed at $124.76. On January 28th, 2022, the stock closed at $170.33. What was the relative change from March to January, round to the nearest hundredth? Okay, so March happened first. So this is the initial value. Forgot the L there. January, right, this happened second or last, so this is the final. So remember, to find the relative change, we first have to find the absolute change. So we take the absolute value of the final value minus the initial value. So I will take January value of 170.33 minus the initial value of 124.76. Now, when I subtract those, I get the absolute value of 45.57. The absolute value means we want the positive, right? How far away is that from 0? And so we end up with the absolute change of 45.57. Now, that's great and all, but that's not the question. The question is, what was the relative change? So we know that relative change is absolute change divided by the initial value. So I would take 45.57 divided by my initial value of 124.76. You'll also notice that the direction said round to the nearest hundredth. So in my question here, right here, I can divide. 45.57 divided by 124.76 gives me 0.36526 ... Nearest hundredth. The 6 is in the hundredth place. So that means I look one place past, 5 rounds up, and so I get 0.37 as my relative change. Let's do one more quick example. Miguel started the day of errands with 372 miles to empty on the gas gauge. When the errands were finished, the gas gauge read 147 miles to empty. What is the relative change from start of errands to the end in miles to empty, round to the nearest hundredth? Okay, so started, that means this is the initial value. Ended, that means this is the final value. So we start with the absolute change. Absolute value of final minus initial. That's the absolute value of negative 225, which we know is a positive 225. Absolute value always comes out positive. Now, when I want to find the relative change, I take the absolute change and divide by the initial value of 372. This is why I like to label my items, so I can always go back and easily see what I need. So I end up with 0.60483, blah, 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 blah. Hundredths place, 4 rounds down, so 0.60. I highly recommend, until you have all of this in your brain, go ahead and write down final value minus initial value. Right? Absolute change over initial value. You notice I didn't write everything out. You can abbreviate, but by writing down the formulas, it's going to help you remember and understand, which is half of the battle.